Welcome to my research presentation, Vexed by Vinyl. Today I will be analyzing record collecting culture through the lens of materialist media ecology. So with that, and in order to examine this thesis, we'll be using the lens of materialist media ecology. So what exactly is that? You can see Dr. Steimer's definition here on the slide just to kind of give you a source. But to put this into my own words, we're not just looking at the landfills that media materials end up in. We're looking at the entire lifespan of these materials and the effects of how they're produced and utilized by us as consumers, aka dirt research. There's also the production studies approach, which relies on interviews and observations with the people who are involved in production activities of media industries. However, my project mostly aligns with the principles of dirt research. Additionally, we're not just focusing on the environment, such as the atmosphere and ecosystems, but also everything that lives here on Earth. So how these activities come back to bite us as humans and affect wildlife, plant life, etc. I'll be using this lens to look at my thesis, which is: the revival of record collecting culture, especially production of special edition vinyl variants, has severe consequences on the environment, including material waste, environmental hazards, and bodily harm of all living things. So again, in looking at these issues with vinyl records, we're going to be looking at the environment holistically rather than just one aspect in order to align with the principles of materialist media ecology. So let's start out with production. Vinyls are primarily made out of PVC, and according to the Ecology Center, which is a nonprofit targeted to the environmental advocacy, PVC is a very common yet toxic plastic, and its production, for both records and for other purposes, is incredibly harmful to the environment. So first of all, the production process when it comes to making the actual PVC is extremely hazardous. PVC stands for polyvinyl chloride, and in order to make PVC, you need to produce chlorine gas. Chlorine gas in and of itself is toxic for most life forms, but also requires the use of other toxic materials, which usually are asbestos, mercury, or other PFAS chemicals, in order to trigger that reaction. And so because the materials used to make PVC are so toxic, especially to humans, sometimes manufacturers use forced labor methods. For example, in China, a group called Uyghurs, which are an ethnic minority primarily comprised of Muslim individuals, are responsible for a disproportionate 10% of the world's PVC production. Additionally, with any kind of big plant of this material, there's the risk of spills, which can release toxic materials into the environment, such as vinyl chloride, which is incredibly carcinogenic. And then lastly, on the note of just the fact that vinyls are made of PVC, PVC is not a very durable material. We'll get into this in terms of waste later, but PVC can break down if it's exposed to heat or light, releasing plasticizers and stabilizers. Plasticizers are harmful to the human body and other life forms, known for harming reproductive health, exacerbating asthma symptoms, and causing developmental issues in children. Stabilizers, on the other hand, include lead and other toxic metals known to have harmful health effects. If not disposed of properly, these materials can end up in our ecosystems and our oceans. Now, with vinyl specifically, again, looking at that Grille article, vinyls need to be pressed, which requires a lot of energy. Vinyls are created by using an extremely hot press to compress the PVC material into a disc and create those grooves that the needle of a record player will ride along. This, of course, uses up fossil fuels common in the manufacturing process. Additionally, vinyls produce a ton of carbon dioxide emissions. 1.9 thousand tons of carbon dioxide are produced for every 4 million records, and 50 million records were sold in 2023. So with simple math, that's nearly 24,000 tons of carbon dioxide produced for just 1 year. So in just production alone, there are serious environmental hazards and harms to living things. Now, getting into packaging, this is where we really see the material waste start to come in. Vinyls typically come in gatefolds made of paper and are then wrapped in plastic in order to protect them. Now, where does this plastic wrap go? Right to the trash. Additionally, lots of record comes with extras like song lyric booklets or photographs. While they're typically made of recycled material, they often aren't disposed of properly, creating more material waste. And then you get into shipping materials for those who have their vinyl shipped individually. You can see this image on the left of a vinyl record mailer pack that is being sold. Vinyls are often shipped in cardboard boxes, which is great because it's recyclable, but are people recycling it and disposing of it responsibly? That's another question to be asked. Also, sometimes they'll be shipped with packing peanuts or styrofoam padding, which is horrible for the environment, not at all biodegradable. It's done this way to protect the vinyl, again, because PVC can be really delicate, but it definitely still contributes to material waste. Again, this information all comes from Grille. And then there's the practice of shipping itself. So according to an article from the Daily Bruin at UCLA, 59% of vinyl sales come from large distributors rather than simply going to a record store and picking out what you like. I'm talking shipping directly to your door from Target, Amazon, Walmart, or other individual artists' websites. This, of course, is going to have its own environmental impact in terms of carbon footprint. So why does vinyl specifically contribute to this much waste? In part, this is due to a concept called planned obsolescence, which we learned about in our class discussion of materialist media ecology. Again, I've provided Dr. Steimer's definition on the slides, but to put this in my own terms, products are made to fail at some point down the line in order to promote repurchasing somewhere else. There are two main ways that we can see this when it comes to vinyls. First is that vinyls, as previously mentioned, are made of PVC, and PVC is a very cheap material. Earlier, I talked about its lack of durability, and that certainly comes into play here. They're not made to last. They need to be cleaned a certain way. Vinyls can get dusty, but you need to clean them in the correct way. If you get a vinyl wet, it's no longer going to be playable. Clearly, based on this evidence from Grille, the major downfall of vinyl is that they're less likely to last compared to these other forms of consuming music. Additionally, this lack of durability is not only something that's pushed by manufacturers, but the way that we consume vinyl contributes to these ideas as well. When selling records, sellers are often asked to rate the condition of the vinyl sleeve and the actual media playability. On Discogs, for example, which is a website used to catalog, buy, and sell vinyls, conditions are listed as mint, good, fair, poor, etc. The further away from mint that you go, the decrease in value that you'll see with a vinyl. Additionally, small imperfections, like if the record skips on one song, if it's slightly warped, or if it's discolored in one area, that can do the same thing. So with the fact that vinyl isn't exactly a reliable material, yet collectors still can be very particular and picky when it comes to buying their records, manufacturers know this, and they've certainly taken advantage of it. So now I want to get into a little bit about vinyl variants as a specific sector of record collecting culture that has been exacerbating all of these issues related to material waste, environmental hazards, and bodily harm. So what exactly is a vinyl variant? Well, this can include any record of the same album that just has one thing different about it. So some come in different colors, some come as a deluxe edition, some include bonus tracks, anniversary editions, and some vinyls are just a single song release. This practice can be incredibly wasteful as a result of overconsumption. It's the same media minus the case of a deluxe or bonus track, but we're buying it over and over again. So why are artists doing this? Well, according to the Daily Bruin at UCLA again, it's not just for the money, it's also for the charts. Artists and their teams know that superfans will buy multiple copies of the albums that they're releasing, and they'll use it to their advantage to sell more copies to improve their spot on the charts. Although she isn't the only person to blame, Taylor Swift is probably the most well-known example of this, especially since she's been slammed on social media by other artists. Her most recent release, The Tortured Poets Department, has 19 versions across CDs, vinyls, and cassettes. Additionally, if you look at her entire discography, she has 68 collectible vinyls according to Discogs. So with just one artist, that's a lot of variance, a lot of overconsumption, and a lot to be talked about when it comes to environmental consequences. All this to say, vinyl variants are a very clear example of planned innovation. I've provided Dr. Steimer's definition here again, but planned innovation essentially relies on evolution. It's the release of one next big new shiny thing to the next, and releasing them in a sort of timeline that results in further consumption. At its core, we're normally looking at the same device, but a few new sparkly features have been added. Deluxe releases are just that. Like I said before, record labels know that if a superfan's favorite artist puts out a new edition of an album, they're probably going to buy it, and they strategize based off of this. For example, Sabrina Carpenter released her album Short and Sweet last summer and released a vinyl before the album was even about to come out. But then, in the beginning of this year, she released a deluxe version of the album and, of course, a new edition of the vinyl to follow. Her team knew that a deluxe was coming and still chose to sell the standard edition of the vinyl. Why? Because they know that fans are in a rush to get their hands on their favorite artist's music as soon as possible. And fans also don't know that the deluxe is coming months later. That's planned innovation at its finest. Again, the strategy is not unique to Sabrina Carpenter. This is just the first example I could think of off the top of my head. So, taking a look at Taylor Swift again, the University of Glasgow actually created a report that surveyed over 1,000 fans about how Swifties consume vinyl. Again, I pose these statistics not to single out Taylor Swift, but to demonstrate the effects of vinyl collecting culture and marketing on the environment. So, starting off, 57% of survey respondents reported having multiple editions of the same album, and that's over half. So when you think about what it takes to produce those vinyls and where they might end up, that's a lot of excess waste when it comes to streaming the same music. That brings me to my next point, which is that 87% of respondents were listening to these albums on streaming platforms frequently or all of the time, meaning that the vinyl to them isn't really a means of hearing the music, it's a means of ownership when it comes to music. Yet, only 26% of respondents said they'd be interested in buying a sleeve with a digital edition of the album in order to reduce PVC waste. So we're all aware of the waste that's being created. We're aware that we have other ways to consume media that don't create plastic waste, yet we still want that shiny new vinyl and all of its possible variants. Still, 89% of respondents were either fairly or very concerned about climate change. Taking these points, the conclusion we can draw is that if variants are produced, people are going to buy them, even if they're trying to be conscious about the environment, meaning that planned innovation works. And this is just one survey of 1,000 Swifties. So imagine how these attitudes shape vinyl consumerism on a larger scale and contribute to waste. Vinyl variants are multiplying the waste that we would see if every artist just released a standard version of their vinyl. Of course, there are still going to be those vinyls that break or deteriorate over time, but with just one standard edition, we decrease production, packaging, and shipping waste. Nearly all of these vinyls will end up in landfill someday, so it's worth calling into question if just that one bonus song or that extra color is worth the extra waste that will eventually come of it. So for the past several slides, I've been talking about the detriments of vinyl records and why they can be so harmful to the environment. But that doesn't mean that other forms of music are necessarily better for the environment. So I'm presenting streaming as the alternative. Right off the bat, overconsumption is less of an issue. Artists aren't really releasing variants like they do with vinyls. Maybe they release an a cappella or an acoustic version of a song, but once you pay for the streaming service, that's kind of it from the buyer's perspective. There's no incentive to buy more. Next, you don't really have that material waste because everything is being released online, and you don't run the risk of damage that comes with the physical media of a record. Material waste is really the huge drawback when it comes to vinyl records, as stated by the Grille articles. So, is streaming better? Well, let's look at the cons. I've found an article from the University of Georgia's Grady News Source. First of all, the greenhouse gas emissions that it takes in order to make streaming possible, including uploading, transporting media, and the actual streaming itself, is off the charts. Streaming is projected to emit between 200 to 350 million kilograms of greenhouse gases just in the United States, versus 157 million kilograms of greenhouse gases from physical media as recorded in the year 2000. While there's still a wide range provided here, if you look at the upper limit, that's over double the greenhouse gases coming from all that encompasses streaming versus the production of all physical media, not just vinyls. Additionally, the more you stream, the more carbon that's emitted. On the other hand, with the vinyl, you're not emitting anything to play the music itself over and over. The rest of the cons come from the Richard Maxwell article we read in class from the Media Industries Journal titled Media Industries and the Ecological Crisis. Especially in the United States, there's a humongous issue with overconsumption of technological devices. In 2013, we spent over $3.7 trillion on consumer electronics, mostly in mobile device sales, which is what we're most likely to stream music on. And again, these numbers are from 2013, and smartphone addiction has gotten far worse since then. Maxwell acknowledges that there's a tie between what device you have and your mobility, which again goes back to planned innovation as discussed before. Additionally, these devices that we're streaming on use a lot of energy. First of all, it takes a lot of energy to manufacture these devices, in addition to similar chemicals and gases that we saw with the production of vinyls. But also, as you continue to use these devices, they need to be charged, expending energy from the grid and continuing energy consumption beyond manufacturing. Sure, a record player needs to be plugged in, but only when it's in use. You're not charging it every day, multiple times a day, like you are with a mobile device. And last, you have the cloud, which uses up a ton of data for its data centers. The demand of the cloud is only increasing, especially in the music industry, where streaming continues to be popularized over alternative formats such as physical media and radio. So there's the energy it takes to stream the music, but also to store it. Based on this information, I would argue that while streaming might be more efficient and convenient, it's not really much better for the environment. So to wrap things up, I want to come back to the vinyl. Obviously, just because something is bad for the environment doesn't mean people will stop consuming it. There are countless cases where this is true. So alternatively, what are some ways that we can make production and consumption of vinyls better for the environment? Well, earlier we talked about plastic and styrofoam waste from packaging. An easy change is to use something more sustainable, like a biodegradable plastic. Eco-vinyl and recycled vinyl. Recycled vinyl is exactly what it sounds like, and eco-vinyl can be that, or it can be made out of bio-sourced PVC. You see in the picture here that the record's kind of got a tie-dye marbled look because it's made out of recycled pieces, so you get different colors of old PVC. This next one's pretty simple, just on the consumer end, taking care of your vinyls once you purchase them. As I've talked about before, vinyls require specific care so that they don't break, so just taking that extra care to ensure that it doesn't happen can help cut down on waste as well. Next is artist and label accountability. Just release one single edition. I've spoken about how vinyl variants create all this excess consumerism that is built upon growth models and that violates sustainability, so this is another easy fix. In conclusion, we've taken a very comprehensive look of vinyls and the consequences that they can have on the environment. They create material waste in production, packaging, and shipping, as well as in their afterlives. They can cause environmental harm through emissions and energy consumption in production. They can also cause harm to living things with exposure to toxic metals and plasticizers, as well as the potential for spills in production. However, sometimes the streaming alternative really is not that much better. So it is up to manufacturers, artists, labels, and consumers to work together to make vinyl more sustainable at all stages. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Here is my work cited. Here is more of my work cited. And here are all of the images I've cited. Thank you.